Operations continue at this time in full force, and they will continue until all of our objectives are achieved. We have very strong objectives. They could have done something 2 weeks ago, but they just couldn't get there. CENTCOM shared the news that 3 U.S. military service members have been killed in action. As one nation, we grieve for the true American patriots who have made the ultimate sacrifice for our nation, even as we continue the righteous mission for which they gave their lives. We pray for the full recovery of the wounded and send our immense love and eternal gratitude to the families of the fallen. And sadly, there will likely be more. Before it ends, that's the way it is, likely be more.
President Trump warning there will likely be more U.S. troops killed and wounded as part of Operation Epic Fury. We have all the angles covered to this fast-moving story, including the latest on the attacks, how Iran is responding, who is leading that country, what the Trump administration's strategy might be, the push by members of Congress to have a say in the matter, the economic impact on oil markets, and much more. Good morning and welcome to Morning Joe. It is Monday, March 2nd. We have top reporters and foreign policy and military experts assembled to start us off this Monday morning. The co-host of our 9 a.m. hour, staff writer at The Atlantic, Jonathan Lemire, is here. Columnist and associate editor at The Washington Post, David Ignatius. President Emeritus of the Council on Foreign Relations, Richard Haass. Decorated combat veteran and former commander of U.S. Army Europe, retired Army Lieutenant General Mark Hertling is with us. And presidential historian and Pulitzer Prize-winning author John Meacham joins us this morning.
So why don't we really quickly, before we get into the strikes that are intensifying across the Middle East, let's just, a lot obviously happened over the weekend. We were here on Saturday morning, but even since then, so much has changed. David, why don't you give us a debrief? Like you, I was calling and speaking to people in the administration this weekend, and nobody off camera is suggesting this is going to be quick or easy. They're talking about a several-step process that may take up to 6 weeks, and they start by decapitating the leadership. They move on to cut off any abilities for them to strike neighbors in the region, and that may take a while. But then they're even talking about, after destroying nuclear and ballistic missiles, the ability for production of those missiles. And talking to this well-placed administration official, the idea seems they are going to tear up from the roots, any war-making ability that Iran has created since 1979. This is not going to be a one-and-done or a quick strike, at least based on what everything I heard on Sunday and from our allies. Get us up to date on your latest reporting.
So, Joe, I'm hearing the same thing. I think there were concerns because President Trump has liked the quick in and out, hit hard and then pull back and negotiate approach, that might be the case here. But it doesn't seem to be. In his broadcast remarks to the country yesterday, he said this will go on. He told the New York Times he had a timeline of 3 to 4 weeks, which is substantial. He said he had the ammunition supplies to conduct a long war of that dimension. He called on the Iranian people again to rise up and change the regime, which indicates he has substantial ambitions for this. One Middle Eastern friend noted early this morning that there's an element of jazz improvisation to the way that Trump is conducting this war. There are different themes that are conflicting. He says he's ready to talk one day to Iranian leaders, but then the next day he's talking about this long campaign to, as you say, take the regime out root and branch. In terms of the firepower expended so far, it's substantial. Estimates from U.S. Central Command and others are that 2,000 targets have been hit in these first 2 days of the war in Iran. The number of targets hit by Iran in the Gulf is in the 500 range. We now have a war that's expanded significantly into Lebanon as Hezbollah fires into Israel and Israel retaliates. So when we talk about the danger of a regional war, well, we've got one. Don't worry about the danger anymore, because we actually have a regional war now. And I think the key thing, just to conclude this, Joe, is for the president to make the case to the country that the benefits of this war in terms of changing Iran, finally, after the 1979 revolution, having a more responsible country in the region, are worth all the pain. Without political support, we're going to see, I fear, what we have in the past in the Middle East, which is that the country tires of war soon, and the promises that an American president makes, the country just isn't willing to deliver. So that's President Trump's job now, is to make his case clearly, directly, forcefully to the country, so the country will support a long and really consequential battle against Iran.
Yeah, you look at the numbers from Reuters, Ipsos. Obviously, the president has his work cut out for him. David, one thing, though, whether people supported this war or did not support this war, Stephen Erlanger, who, of course, covered Iran in the 1970s, wrote this morning for the New York Times that regardless of how you feel, this is going to be as consequential, at least in this region, as the collapse of the Soviet Union was. I think we would all agree, the people that have been following and covering Iran in the region over the decades, Iran's regime may survive, writes Erlanger, but the Middle East will be changed. The Islamic Republic, already weakened and unpopular, is now further diminished its power at home in the region at one of its slowest steps since its leaders took power during the revolution to overthrow Iran's American-backed Shah in 78 and 79. Even if the regime does not fall, which remains the stated goal of President Trump, this massive attack is likely to have strategic consequences in the Middle East comparable to the collapse of the Soviet Union. I don't think anybody that's followed the Middle East seriously for some time would disagree with that. I will say, though, David, I think we could do a lot of people a service here who might be reading various reports, seeing what the president's saying to different media outlets, trying to figure out exactly what in the world's going on. You talked about, jazz improvisation. Other people are saying the president's just spitballing. This is what he does. He's trying to figure out how he gets a deal with the Iranians, but he is going to continue, along with Israel, attacking, whether people like it or not. He's going to most likely continue to attack until they take away their war-fighting capability, and will do a deal with whomever he can do a deal with. But you brought it up in our Saturday morning special as the attacks just started. This is now, if somebody wants to understand what Donald Trump is going to do, or the Trump doctrine, it is not what the negotiators are saying. Chances are good. It's like you said, this Viking strike strategy. To somebody that we can work with. David, the same thing most likely is what the president's strategy is here, regardless of what he says to journalists, right?
So, Joe, we did talk early Saturday morning about Trump conducting the Viking way of war, using speed and surprise to launch raids and then pull back and take the political and trade benefits of that. This is going to be something more sustained than a Viking raid. It's clear.
Right.
That idea that I think we were right in describing the early hours of the war, I think is being replaced by the reality that this is now a big regional war. And it's a war that's going to go to the heart of what has been destabilizing the Middle East since I began covering it in 1980, which was the Iranian Revolution of the year before. That revolution continues to rumble. It's a destabilizing factor throughout the region, certainly in Lebanon, certainly in Syria, certainly in Gaza. So I think Trump has decided to go to the heart, supported by Israel. It's been very interesting to see in the day plus that the war has been going on, countries that were initially very wary, like Britain. Britain didn't want to let the United States use its bases for this war because it doubted the rationale. They're now beginning to open up their bases. Similarly, our Gulf friends in the UAE and Saudi Arabia, initially very cautious, suspicious, did this really make sense? Now have decided, they're getting punched in the nose by Iran. They're getting the missiles landing at their hotels and their properties across the Gulf, and they're angry, and they're moving toward being ready to fight back. So I think the elements for support for Trump's coalition are strengthening. And as you said at the outset, this is going to be about the fundamental destabilizing nature of the Iranian regime and a broad desire in the region to change it.
Well, and speaking of Great Britain, that is going to be a lingering impact of the decision of Keir Starmer not to let the president use the U.S. base in Great Britain to launch this attack. The administration, of course, enraged by that decision. We'll see how that plays out. But, Mika, there's no doubt, I think anybody, I would guess most people here, most people across Europe, across the Middle East, relieved that Khomeini has been killed, relieved that a lot of the worst of the worst in Iran have been killed. But this now is, of course, exploding into a regional conflict, as everybody suspected it would be. So we don't know where this goes. The White House doesn't know where this goes. It could be over if Iran topples in a week. It could be over in a week, but that's unlikely.
Yeah.
The White House is thinking 4 to 6 weeks at the least.
So the conflict expanded into a new front just hours ago as Israel were seen rising earlier near the U.S. Embassy in Kuwait as the State Department urges U.S. citizens to shelter in place there. Over the weekend, 3 U.S. service members were killed in action in Kuwait, the first Americans to die in the war with Iran, although President Trump acknowledged there, quote, likely will be more. Iran's retaliation to Operation Epic Fury has been expansive, targeting many of its Middle East neighbors. As the country's top national security leader said late last night, Tehran, quote, will not negotiate with the United States. President Trump, meanwhile, told The Atlantic he's open to speaking to Iran's new leadership without specifying whom those talks would be with. He also told the New York Times the attack could last 4 or 5 weeks, but he did not lay out a clear plan for how power might be transferred to a new government. ABC's Jonathan Karl says the president told him the U.S. had identified possible candidates to take over Iran, but they, too, were killed in the initial attack. Quote, it's not going to be anybody that we were thinking because they're all dead. Second or third place is dead.
Jonathan Lemire, give us your latest reporting from the White House.
So, Joe, obviously, this is a defining moment for this presidency. Someone who President Trump, of course, in 2016, we know, vowed to end the forever wars of Iraq and Afghanistan, vowed he would not be entangled in a new Middle Eastern conflict. That no longer the case. What we're seeing here is, we heard from President Trump, is a lack of messaging really to the nation. He's recorded 2 videos that were put out on Truth Social, but has yet to do an address, perhaps from the Oval Office, as were customary from presidents at a time of war. He has yet to field a single question in a news conference. He has, though, done a series of quick phone calls with reporters, although noting, as Mika was starting to there, that messaging seemingly changing each and every time in terms of the length of this mission, some of the objectives of the mission, who might be next. And in that call with Jonathan Karl, it seems like they had identified possible leaders, but then, whoops, killed them too. So that, I think, is unnerving some here at home who aren't sure how long this war will last, what its objectives might be, and how many more Americans may be killed. We know 3 already have. The president, in his message yesterday, sort of saying that's the way it is in terms of the cost of conflict, suggesting there will be more. And we've seen footage this morning of a fighter jet downed in Kuwait, though the pilot seems to have escaped. And Richard Haass, I mean, I'm talking to people in the White House who are certainly pleased with the military objectives so far. And Joe's right at the top of the show. Venezuela is the driving force behind all of this. That was such a success. It has inspired President Trump to believe he can do the same here. There's some who already think Cuba could be next. So the military objectives are strong, but Iran's retaliation has also been widespread despite the decapitation strike. So talk to us about what you've seen in this first day or two in terms of Iran's ability to respond despite the damage inflicted, but also the sort of lack of messaging from the president to make the case to Americans why this conflict is happening, why it's in their interest.
Well, Jonathan, if a word comes to mind for me to describe what's going on now, it's undisciplined. As disciplined as the United States has been on the military side of this war, we have been undisciplined on the foreign policy and political side. We have yet to make the case to the country and the world as to why this war had to happen now. The president's been all over the place as to U.S. objectives. And in the clip you showed at the beginning of the show, if the complete realization of all U.S. objectives has to happen before this war ends. This war is not going to end until literally the Iranian regime falls. That's not something under our control. That might not just be a question of days or weeks. That could be months or years. And that's where the Venezuela parallel comes in. This shows to me a profound misunderstanding of the DNA of Iran, the degree of institutionalization of political, clerical, ideological leadership. Hundreds of thousands of people in the security forces, both the Revolutionary Guards as well as the militia. So to think that somehow the two situations are in any way analogous or parallel is frightening to me. So again, what keeps coming back to me is a lack of discipline as to analysis, as to making the case for why we're doing this, and above all now for war aims and what's our definition of success. And what we're seeing with the Iranian reaction, Iran gets a vote. Yeah, we started the war, but it takes everybody to finish it. And that's the danger. This could be open-ended. And by not consulting with Congress or the American people, the president has put himself on a high wire without a net below. And likely one of two things are going to happen, Jonathan. Either he's going to have to walk back ambitious war aims, or he's going to lose support. I don't think, and history suggests, you cannot sustain support for a war that is costly and doesn't seem to be on a trajectory of success.
So, General Herdling, a couple of things. First of all, and we'll be talking to John Meacham about this next block, but first of all, anybody that is trying to hold Donald Trump to any of the same sort of standards of previous presidents ramping up to war are going to be badly mistaken. We've already seen Maduro, who didn't take his threat seriously, could be living right now in Qatar on the beach. Instead, he's in a jail cell in Brooklyn. You could say the same thing of the Iranians. So I certainly the question will be at the end of this whether there is a method to that madness. But anybody that's looking at what this commander-in-chief is saying, what he's having his negotiators do, what he's saying to the press, they're kidding themselves, because this is the second time the Iranians have been surprised that Donald Trump did what he did in the past 6 months. So speak to that, but also speak, if you will, to the war aims. If you really dig in deep to this, both Israel and the United States, they are not interested in a hit and run here. It looks, again, from everything I've read and everything that's been reported, they're talking about ripping up the Iran's military infrastructure that they've been building up since 1979. Talk about that. Talk about the successes you've seen in the early part of this operation militarily, and also what, if you're there running it, what are your concerns in the coming days and weeks and possibly months?
Yeah, a couple things, Joe. Before I do that, if I could just comment on what everyone else has said. You know, David Ignatius, I loved his phrase improvisation because it follows the ad hocism that was involved in the planning. And improvisation is great for jazz, not so much for combat. When lives are at stake and chaos is usually the environment. Richard said it's undisciplined. That's the way I see it as well. Jonathan said military objectives are extensive and being executed. Well, you know, we're repeatedly showing the strikes against targets, and you know those are all very successful. But as I was taught early on in my time in the military, showing precision strikes when the real question is to what end doesn't really help us right now. We're beyond the point of talking about the strikes because you can win every engagement, hit every target, and lose the war. When we're talking about, I think, the Middle East, which I'm very familiar with and have a whole lot of scar tissue in, what I conclude is external strikes alone can't produce democratic change. We've seen that in multiple conflicts. We saw it in Desert Storm when 45 days of airstrikes was followed up by a ground campaign. If you don't have something to put in place afterwards, it's going to be even tougher than what we saw in Iraq and Afghanistan, because these strikes in the Middle East will usually strengthen the hardliners. It's going to create further chaos. You don't have a security force. If some of the targeting now is not only going after headquarters and air defense system, it's going after, you know, formations where the Revolutionary Guards are, where the Beiji are. They're trying to kill those forces that provide security for a regime. So whenever you lose security in a society and you have people rising up looking for leadership, there's a huge disconnect. So what I would say from the military standpoint, yes, the strikes are being executed with great precision and effects. But I mean, I hate to say this as a military guy, you have to at one point say, so what? Are we just destroying things? Are we just bombing targets? What is going to happen right now? It is a pipe dream to think people are going to rise up when they're continuing to see their nation being struck, when their security forces are being dismantled, when there's no government leadership, when you don't have the people running the organization, and you have public unrest. Okay, great. First day, the leader was being overthrown. But now we're seeing the escalation in other countries. The last thing I'd talk about is the president, when he was talking to the New York Times last night, talked about the amount of munitions that are being used. 2,000 strikes as of this morning, about that number. Precision weaponry used in all of them. Defensive systems like the Patriot missiles and the THAAD batteries that are protecting various Gulf states and soldiers in the regions have very expensive missiles that they shoot. Those can only last so long. And as we've said, the intel estimates say that Iran has anywhere from 10,000 to 20,000 missiles that they can launch. You can only shoot them down with so many defensive weapons. So the dynamics of expenditure gets into something called battlefield math. And somebody at the Pentagon is now concluding, where are we taking risk around other places in the world? I know they're doing that in the Pentagon because that used to be my job. When we were in Iraq and Afghanistan in the early 2000s, my job as the J7 to say, what risk are we incurring elsewhere as we're using all of our resources, intelligence gathering, formations, airplanes, naval ships, and especially weapon systems that cost a lot and take a long time to produce, are all on the ballot to say, how long can we conduct these strikes? 4 to 5 weeks, as the president of the New York Times last night, is a very long time.
All right, up next, we're going to get